Well, hello, everybody, and a big welcome to everyone joining us tonight, especially our students and colleagues, and hello to anyone watching the recording of this session. So yes, a reminder there that this session is indeed being recorded and will appear on our web pages at some point. We also have recordings of the previous sessions on our web pages as well. I'll pop the link into our chat. I'm Zalfa Fagali, you all know me. I'm a lecturer in American Literature in English and the Center for American Studies. I'm chairing this session. Big shout out to my colleagues giving up their time tonight, especially after a full day of teaching. It's much appreciated. Thank you. This is the final event in a series organized by us, colleagues in the Center for American Studies. We've met up every Thursday for the last 5 weeks to discuss this election from a range of different perspectives, from women and voting rights to the impact of the election on other countries in the Americas to Black Lives Matter and more. We're really pleased that so many of you have joined us for these events, and we think they're excellent examples of the kind of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary thinking that we need to make sense of the world right now. So I think we were all expecting an unusual election. It's probably fair to say that many of us expected to stay up all night on Tuesday, but we didn't think we'd start our working day quite horrified and confused by what was going on, and certainly not 2 working mornings later, although today looks a little more solid in some ways, I suppose. There's a lot to say, so I'm going to be quiet soon. My colleagues are here to talk through everything and answer your questions. So pop your questions into the chat as usual. If you've been here before, you know that our discussions are informal, but informative. So we do need your questions in order to have these conversations. We have 4 speakers today. I'll introduce them now and then they'll take questions at the end. So in speaking order, we have Alex Wadden. Hi, Alex. Andrew Johnston, George Lewis, and Deborah Toner. So Alex, take it away.
Okay, everybody, thanks for coming along here. And as Zalfa says, we've really enjoyed doing these events. So thanks for those of you who've participated. I'll come back and thank Zalfa properly at the end, who's made this all work for us. I'm going to string together a random series of thoughts, really. I'll talk a little bit about where the race is now and what might happen over the next day or 2 days. And then I'll say something about the polling. And then, as I say, just some thoughts about where the US is, I think, in terms of its political landscape, and maybe offer a few personal comments at the end. I guess I should start, though, by apologising for my very misleading analysis last week in terms of who was going to win what. But that does tell us an important life lesson, I think, and that is stay close to the shore. Don't swim out into the treacherous waters of optimism. Just stay on the shallow end and play around in pessimism, because it's much safer. Okay, not more seriously, that is very serious. But just in terms of where we are now, I think everybody, well, I don't know what everybody knows, but those who have been following this, you'll know that we're now down to a handful of states. And if Trump wins all of those states, then he will be president. He will remain president. Biden needs to pick up 1 or 2 states. I know if you look at the Electoral College vote count at the moment, some sites are giving Biden at 264, which leaves him only 6 off 270, which would mean he'd only need to win Nevada to win the presidency. Others have got it at 253. And the difference is some websites are giving Arizona to Biden on the basis of the Fox News and AP calling it for Biden actually quite early on. Fox and AP are using a different methodology for calling states than most of the other networks. Oddly, that was meant to be a more conservative methodology, and people thought they'd be slower in calling states. But they seem to have jumped the gun in terms of Arizona, and they have jumped the gun. I don't think they should have called it. And certainly, when we look at the numbers now, it's quite plausible that Trump can come back and take Arizona. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's certainly plausible. The Biden campaign seemed very confident that they're going to win Philadelphia, even though they're still 115,000 votes behind Trump in Pennsylvania. At the moment, there's a lot of votes to come in from Philadelphia and other heavily Biden areas. These are mail-in votes from Democratic areas. So you can expect that lots of these votes would be for Biden, and then you can expect that because they're mail-in votes, which were predominantly Democrat as well, you've got a sort of double Democrat bonus in terms of these votes. So certainly the Biden camp and most of the analysts seem to suggest that Pennsylvania will turn to Biden. If that's the case, then he will be the next president. There's lots of caveats in terms of legal challenges to that. Other states in play, Georgia, Biden's really catching up in Georgia, but there may not be enough votes left now for that to become Biden taking the state. Again, if he takes Georgia, it's finished. The Trump campaign are effectively looking at overturning Biden's lead in Arizona, holding on to Pennsylvania. So just keep an eye. We're not going to find out anything in the next half an hour, so I won't update you before the end of tonight. Arizona is going to give us some important numbers at 2 o'clock in the morning UK time. So some of us, another sleepless night ahead. But the race is very tight. It's that no ladies have sung at all yet in terms of whether this is over. Biden is the favourite. He's got more paths to victory, but it's plausible that this could still end up with a re-election of President Trump. The one thing I did get right last week was talking about the Electoral College and the popular vote. Biden is going to win the popular vote probably by about 4 to 5%. And I think the one thing I did get right last week when I was talking about this, if Biden's winning the popular vote by 4%, the Electoral College is a 50-50 bet. And I think that's where we are now. So that it's a minoritarian system. And I'll say a little bit more about that in terms of the Senate as well later on. Okay, let's just quickly think about the polls. I owe Zalfa an apology in a way here, but a couple of weeks ago, Zalfa sort of said we shouldn't trust the polls. And I was a bit sort of, oh, yes, we should. Well, no, we shouldn't. There's been a serious polling area. The polling area is probably about as big as it was in 2016 in terms of overrest. Now, this time around, Biden's lead, in the sense that Biden was far enough ahead that he can survive a polling area, which Hillary Clinton couldn't. The broader point here is, I think this is actually it's worry if the polls are off. If we can't get polling right, it just brings my discipline of politics and political science into some disrepute, because we use polling all the time in terms of providing evidence and trying to understand the world. So if we're getting it wrong, that in itself is a little bit of a problem. And again, it just sort of further deepens skepticism about what we're being told and about people who are trying to do the right thing. I think most of them, not all of them, there's some really bad polling goes on, deliberately sort of misleading, but most of the pollsters are really trying to do a good job. They're trying to get it right. They're trying to work out what's happening. And so when they get it wrong, we shouldn't sort of cheer or, it's damaging to credibility of people who are trying to get things right. And given the skepticism about experts at the moment, that's just a worrying trend, I think, for all of us. Okay, I'm sure that people will be asking at some point that, would a different candidate than Biden have been a more convincing one for the Democrats? I'm not going to answer that question now. I think Angie's going to address that a little bit as well. I'm quite happy to talk about that in the chat. But that sort of Owen Jones's column in The Guardian today was sort of making the point the Democrats should be more on the left. It's an interesting argument, and we can come back to that. But more broadly, even if Biden, assuming that Biden does win, there certainly won't be a progressive agenda. He's not going to be able to follow a progressive agenda, whatever his inclinations, because the Democrats are not going to control Senate at the end of all of this. And if anything, the polling areas were even worse when they were polling Senate elections than when they were polling for the presidency. So Susan Collins got re-elected very comfortably in Maine, and she was apparently going to lose. Tom Tillis looks like he's going to win relatively comfortably in North Carolina again. That was meant to be a really close race. The point I would make in terms of leftists, the Democrats who flipped Senate seats are John Hickenlooper in Colorado, and it looks like Mark Kelly's going to flip the seat in Arizona and win that for the Democrats. They are two very moderate centrist figures. This doesn't give me any pleasure to say this, but it just, in terms of the ones who win in these sort of moderate centrist states, the Democrats tend to win when they put up moderate figures. From a Democrat point of view, really it wasn't a great night. It looks like they're going to be a net loss of Democrats in the House. Not many. They'll keep control of the House of Representatives. But at the moment, they're about 8 down. They may recapture a couple, but the Democrats can have a net loss in the House. So that's, anyway, I'll move away from election data now and just say a couple of points, which I think will be repeated again, but I'll say them briefly. what this shows us is the US is a deeply polarized nation. This isn't news. Lots of people have been writing about how polarized the US has been, but I think just it bears re-emphasizing. I guess to me, the manifest failures of this presidency are just astonishing. The brutality of it, the bullying nature of it, the obnoxiousness of it, quite frankly. But not just that. I mean, some people like bullies. Just the failure of governance. This administration has done nothing for the white working class, the blue collar white working class who was meant to be, who come out in droves and support this administration. There's been no economic policies which have been guiding towards improving the economic status of those people. This is an administration which has no competence in governing. It's a president who has no interest in governing. Since end of August, the US has been, the massive COVID relief package, which was passed in March, hasn't been renewed. There have been lots and lots of negotiations to try and get it going again. Not a sign of Trump getting involved in those negotiations. His Treasury Secretary has been involved, but no personal intervention from the president whatsoever, beside the odd bonkers tweet, which is contradicted by the next tweet 5 minutes later. However manifest the failings, it doesn't seem to shift opinion. Trump's vote has gone up by about 5 million since 2016. I mean, that tells us that Biden's vote has gone up a lot more than Clinton's was. But, there hasn't been a disintegration of support for Trump at all. And that just suggests that people really will vote for who they support, regardless of the evidence of how good a job they're doing. As I say, and just to finish on that, I guess the next question is, even if Trump is beaten, is Trumpism beaten? Is that brand of politics, that brand of faux populism, is that alive and kicking, or can it be disentangled from Trump? Is it possible actually you can get a competent version of that populism? There's a couple of senators about Josh Hawley actually is a credible version of Trump. There's Tom Cotton in Arkansas. I'm not sure how credible he is, but there are people who have adopted that brand of politics. And I think I'd said numerous times, people have heard me say this, that for me, the important thing was not just beating Trump, but was that Trumpism be repudiated, it be rebuked for what it is. Well, I'll settle for it just losing, quite frankly, now, because it's not been repudiated. And I'll end on that cheery note.
Thanks, Alex. We're back to original Alex, I think, there. My optimistic go-to friend is gone.
Died a painful death, Alpha.
Oh, no. Andrew, whenever you're ready.
Okay. I don't actually have a lot to add. Alex has said, I think, a fair bit that I would say. I mean, I have a number of points, but again, I think Alex to a certain extent has already said some of them. First, this election was always going to be close. I got some flack last week for being cautious. And that's partly because I'm a bit of a pessimist at heart. The glass is not half full. It's not only half empty, but it's literally evaporating before our eyes. But it was also because I thought it was always going to be close. And this is partly a result of the nature of American politics. It's in large part a result of the Electoral College, which, as Alex has said, is a significant effect on the way that the popular vote translates into how the president is selected. And the fact that it currently does that in a way that favors the Republican Party meant that even though Biden had a lead in the polls, and according to some of those polls, a very big lead, again, this was always going to be close. So I think a lot of people woke up on yesterday afternoon, and were quite shocked that we didn't have any conclusive answer. Well, I don't know. Again, maybe the natural pessimist in me is never disappointed because I never have particularly high expectations. But this is why, despite the fact that Biden has won the popular vote by 3.5 million, we're still unsure of what's happening on Thursday. I mean, even if the polls had been correct, a different configuration of votes across different states could still have seen an even bigger popular vote translate into an Electoral College victory for Trump. So yeah, I never particularly thought that this was going to be a close one. I think I can give myself that. What else did I predict that was correct? Trump has been predictably awful. Declaring victory, relentless tweeting, wanting the vote stopped. I mean, none of this is a surprise. I think most of us would have predicted that. He has been phenomenally unpresidential. Some of you may have seen on Twitter today going around the concession speech by George H.W. Bush when he was beaten by Clinton. And I mean, just trying to imagine it coming out of Trump's mouth is just impossible. Three, and this may be the sort of the biggest point that I would want to reiterate, is that this was never going to be a silver bullet election. This was never going to see, I suppose, Trump's brand of conservatism just sort of vanish and dissolve. Even a bigger electoral college victory would not have seen the end of the kind of right-wing populism that Trump has been practicing. America was divided before Trump. It will continue to be so after, assuming, of course, that he does indeed lose. Trump is a cause of much of the rancor of the last few years, but he's also a symptom of divisions that existed when he was still merely a roller coaster businessman or a mere game show host. Even a big win wasn't going to make all of this go away. Point four, it looks like the polls were off again. It's a little too soon to say why. It's a little too soon to say a lot, frankly, which is one of the reasons why I'm not saying much. But yeah, Alex is being quite sympathetic to them, and you know, translating the polls into the electoral college is a tough job. But one thing I do have sympathy for is the idea that human interaction can't always be reduced to mere numbers, and that some qualitative perspectives might be useful, with absolutely no apologies to the political scientists here present. Finally, and again, I think this builds on some of the things I've seen today. If Biden does win, I think the Democrats should be happy. The Republicans would be if they won. It seems like the Democrats always lose, even when they win. Someone posted a Daily Telegraph link there in the chat just before I came on, and I don't think it's any surprise that the Telegraph is spinning this as basically the progressive forces have lost, Trumpism has won. I'm not remotely surprised you're seeing that coming out of the Telegraph. But also, again, as Alex has hinted, you're getting self-flagellation coming from the left as well. So it seems as if, again, the Democrats can't win. Well, I think that if they have won, they should be pleased. They've done very well. Republicans have come out in big numbers. Well, Biden has managed, despite not being the most dynamic candidate that everyone would want, he's got Democratic voters out in enormous numbers as well. And I'm less impressed by the idea that more people have voted for Biden than anyone else in history. It's like, well, more people have voted for Biden than Lincoln. Well, if you look at the demographics, that's not really a surprise. But again, I genuinely think that this, they'll want to know why the election panned out the way it is, but this isn't something that they should see as a sort of qualified success. I think in part that the polls will be partly to blame for this sense that they haven't sort of met expectations. But this would be a good thing. I don't think you can conclude anything from this about what Bernie would have done, or indeed what further progressive forces might have done. So I'm going to kind of leave that. Again, I'm not trying to trade in sort of what ifs. I suppose to sum up, the only other thing I would say is one thing I was, when we were, what we were watching on Thursday night and thinking, how are so many people, still willing to vote for Trump? I think my sense is that a lot of them aren't voting for Trump. They're voting for Republicans. They're dyed-in-the-wool Republicans. They're people who, regardless of the fact that their potential leader is, again, an incredibly unpresidential president, they'll vote for him because they'd rather vote for a Republican than a Democrat. And it doesn't matter whether it's, again, a former game show host or an empty cupboard or a bag of sand. A lot of people will vote Republican, and I think the same applies on the other side. Again, I think Trump does mobilize a lot of support, but I think an awful lot of people have voted for him because he's a Republican. I don't think we should forget that. To conclude, again, probably because I thought I might have to pad these comments out, I just wanted to say that if there's been a lot of maps, and I just wanted to make it clear that if anyone needs any assistance geographically, I've got my old jigsaw puzzle here. Unfortunately, Utah won't stay in place. But if anyone needs any help, then I can help point out. Nevada, we still need to fill in. Arizona, Georgia, of course, and Pennsylvania. And obviously, I'm here to help illustrate any further subsequent speakers should that be required. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. I think I could have probably used that puzzle map in my class yesterday when I was half asleep and teaching. Thank you very much for that. Next up, George.
Okay. I guess it's been a fairly tumultuous ride from late Tuesday's apparent demolition of polling, which Alex has talked about as a feasible profession, to early Wednesday's catchphrase, which for me was "I'm mourning in America," to today's sense that we're probably where we were always going to end up being at this stage. We just got there by a slightly different route. Given how much is still going on, or I guess still in play, as we now ought to call it, from the peculiar vernacular of US political poll watching, probably more sensible for me to comment on a series of points rather than to construct anything that might pass as a coherent overall narrative. I guess if I repeat some things, we're probably all as tired as I am from staying up to see all those polls, so it's probably a good thing to hear things twice. Let's look at it as a bonus. And if we're all too tired at the end, then we could instead go for some kind of game of US election watch bingo, vote drop, the needle, path to victory, multiple routes to the White House, redshift, split ticket, provisional ballot, stop the count, Nate Silver, Nate Cohen, 538, 530 Nate, Merrick Garland, and also the phrase that has occurred more often than I've ever seen before, someone saying, "I am prayerful that." So those of you who are planning to come to the American Studies pub quiz later on in the month, maybe look out for an election bingo round. Okay, one of the key talking points here, I guess, and one of those which in all probability will not wash away with the tide of history, and like Andrew, I'm coming at this as a historian, is clearly Trump's apparently authoritarian response to his potential loss. Now, many media outlets in particular have been telling us this is an unprecedented misuse of high office and a further stain on the reputation of American democracy. But before we try and place that, as I want to, in a longer historical arc, you can add to that current narrative, I think, two further points. One, that there is a growing sense, and Alex will know more than me about this, that some US citizens who've migrated from regimes that are run by the very kind of strong-armed authoritarian rulers so admired by Trump have responded positively to his style of leadership, and they have voted Republican. Secondly, I think on a related point, that the long tradition of equating the democratic left with socialism, and then in turn with defining socialism as merely communism's underdeveloped younger sibling, or socialism as the gateway drug to communism's addiction, is also alive and well. And who thought that we would be talking of red baiting in an election that we already knew would be defined by race baiting? And not only is it becoming clear, did Cuban exiles in particular and Cuban men within that group really head the red baiting of Joe Biden as a socialist come communist. Even we talked about the Telegraph, but the Times of London referred this morning to it being a good thing if the Democrats didn't win both houses, because they wrote if the Democrats won the Senate as well, this might let Biden's, quote, radical left agenda run rampant. If you wanted a greater idea of how very different the political touch points and wings are in the US to the UK, then that's a very interesting one to try and unpick. But let's go back to that fear of a sudden. There's a bit of a Faustian slip. That fear of a sudden authoritarian lurch. Certainly be wary of it, but don't see it as sudden. Historians of the 1930s show a more than uncomfortable flirtation with elements of fascism across all of the United States. Too often that's neatly packaged as Henry Ford likes Nazis, but it was far more widespread and problematic than that. Even in the post-war world, a senior counsel for a congressional committee widely publicized his assertion that the US was not a democracy. And in fact, the guy was called Ernie Arneson. He got into the contemporary equivalent of a Twitter fight to make his point. He had a very public media baiting battle over US democracy with one of the most popular radio hosts at the time, Drew Pearson, because Pearson's radio sign-off was, quote, make democracy work. Arneson and some of his congressional colleagues took umbrage, saying that the United States was not a democracy. It was a republic. But of course, what really goes without saying, I think, is that we should all remember that for decades, Jim Crow segregation was nothing if not a systematic state-sponsored system of suppression, and voter disenfranchisement was at its heart. So these are long traditions. The fact that registered dogs and also cadavers previously voted in former Georgia state elections would be of little comfort to Trump now, even if he'd probably approve of the sentiment in its context. And I'm sure Alex probably thinks that all dogs should be given the vote, dead or alive. Interesting too, I think, are two emerging narratives, one for Trump, one for Biden. And returning viewers who've been to previous iterations of these events may remember that we've talked in the past about Trump's need to create a narrative for himself to explain a potential loss. He's not a loser, he's a winner. And you could certainly argue that that's one of the drivers of his current Twitter spat with the electoral gods. But and I don't want to make you feel any more uncomfortable than you already are. But what if he also needs to start building a narrative for his return with Trump 2024? Step aside, Kanye. My victory was unfairly stolen from me last time. This is unfinished business. I'm coming to regain the mantle of pure American democracy, and no one's going to steal it from me this time. Perhaps just as interesting, though, I think, is another emerging narrative, and that's the narrative of Biden as the great healer, or of Biden as the redeemer of America's great promise. And again, I'd urge caution. As a historian, I'd look to history to justify that caution. If the old parlor game in response to Trump's "Make America Great Again" was, well, when exactly was America last great? And what do you mean by greatness? Perhaps the new Biden-inflected version of the same game is, when was America last healed and whole? Biden, the great healer, I think, is highly unlikely. And I'd suggest that's not just because we've had 4 years of deliberately fermented division. I think one of the great running threads of the history of the United States is that this is a history as much about internal contestation as it is about external power projection. 250 years in, for example, there is still no agreement about how to define Americanism. In fact, there are and there have been rancorous debates on the issue throughout those 250 years, many of which reveal splits and tears within the fabric of the nation, every bit as powerful as those that we've seen over the past presidency. So this is continuity, this is not change. Okay, just two very quick points on which to finish. One, Biden has now become the 7th Democrat in the last 8 presidential races to win the popular vote. So one of the questions that has raised is, should that lead to an end to the Electoral College? Not necessarily. I think if the presidency became elected by popular vote, then electioneering would simply become substantially and significantly different to reflect that new prize, and everybody's strategy would change, and we'd be back in the same paper-thin race differentials. Finally, to go completely out of character, I want to look forward for once rather than backwards. This, as we were hearing earlier on, may now all hinge on Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, this may all hinge on Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, one of the issues in the delay in anointing a Democratic candidate may come from far fewer votes being cast on the day by thousands of university students who would normally be based at Temple, Drexel, and different parts of Penn State. Those institutions, and this will be familiar to many of you now, those institutions have gone online only. And the students have gone home. Under state laws, you're allowed to do that. Here, of course, that's now illegal under the Bojo regime. Looking forward, their votes would have been vital, just as your votes as students will always be vital. And I'll just end by saying, whatever the election and whatever the prize, just make sure you always vote.
Thanks, George. Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I think Deborah's talk is going to connect quite nicely as an end to our session.
Well, I hope so. And I'm going to start by saying I didn't make any predictions last week, so I have no need to apologise. And I'm just going to finish off the round of talks really with a series of personal reflections on the state of things in response to Caitlin Auld posted a comment earlier asking about what we think this means for the state of America, and generally though I'm going to expand that to think about the world at large. And I think it does connect together actually with several of the points that Andrew, Alex and George have already raised. I saw that Alex himself used the word unprecedented in the chat, and unprecedented I think is a word that I've heard a lot lately. You probably have too. The global pandemics produced unprecedented situations for all of us. Events of this election have been unprecedented, and the outcome, whatever it's going to be, is already unprecedented in many ways. Well, I was reading something from the Yucatan Times, a newspaper in Mexico earlier today, that gave me cause to play devil's avocado for a minute and think about what won't be unprecedented tomorrow or the day after or whenever it is we find out for sure who will be president. For those of us hoping for Trump to lose, and I'm very happy to say that I'm very firmly in that camp, what won't be unprecedented is the scale and seriousness of the various social challenges before us. So quoting from the Yucatan Times here, the standard narrative argues that this is the most important election of our lifetimes, but really that was the last time, because like it or not, everything has already changed. Politicians have always been loose with the facts in all countries everywhere, but in the last 4 years, full frontal lying has become so brazenly present and made mainstream by its palpable success, it works, God damn it, that this methodology will not disappear overnight should the incumbent lose. And they go on to talk about the global implications of that change. The last 4 years have emboldened ego-charged wannabes the world over. Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, who I spoke about a bit at the second of these American Studies Center events a few weeks ago. Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Boris Johnson here, Viktor Orbán in Hungary. All of these have shown us into this future. And it's worth noting that whoever ends up in the White House, Bolsonaro, Orbán and Duterte are all scheduled to stay in office until 2022. And while we've certainly had no shortage of general elections and prime ministerial changes in recent years, we aren't at least scheduled to have a different one to Boris Johnson until 2023-24. And I think we see the effects of this sea change in the events of the election night itself and its immediate aftermath. the president of the country that sends election observers into other countries to maintain democratic integrity of elections, claims victory at a point where it looks like he's losing, and makes baseless accusations about electoral fraud, as he continues to do so very volubly using all caps on Twitter. And when asked whether the UK government should be distancing itself from such claims on Wednesday morning, the UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab said he wouldn't be drawn into commenting on the commentary of the campaign. Then the BBC news person said she was actually asking him to comment on the claims by the US president about the validity of the US electoral process in order to claim he'd already been re-elected. Dominic Raab continued to insist with a straight face that he was being asked to pass judgment on the opinions of political pundits and that he was more committed to the impartial truth of the matter than the reporter, with her shocking ability to ask pertinent questions. In subsequent hours and is it days yet? I can't quite keep track of time. It has become necessary for sentences like this to be written. First one from a Washington Times report on international reaction to Donald Trump's election night remarks. A host of foreign officials from Germany to Australia said that it's in the best interest of the United States and the world to ensure all votes are counted. Second example, this from the Guardian live feed a couple of hours ago. Presidential nominees do not claim states, as Trump tried to do yesterday. Nominees win states through securing a majority of the legally cast votes there. Literally sentences explaining how democracy is supposed to work in connection to an election in the United States, which claims to be the leaders of the free world. So, even if we get to breathe a collective sigh of relief when the result is finally called, everything has already changed. Even if he loses, the popularity of Trump's politics, and I do believe they are Trump's politics, but have become subsumed into a broader Republican politics, remains extremely high in America, but also in many other parts of the world. As we in the American Studies Centre have been reflecting over the last few weeks, these are the politics of actively stoking racial divisions and hatred. They're the politics of climate change denialism, of putting children in cages, of misogyny, of defending, if not openly supporting, neo-Nazis, and of leading the world in coronavirus death tolls. These politics are very popular. And the challenge facing anyone who wishes these politics weren't popular is very much precedented. I will stop on that profoundly depressing and slightly angry note.
Thank you, Deborah, for that. Quite reasonable note, I think. I'll just start moving to questions. This is when you all type some more questions into the chat. We've already had quite a few, so please keep them coming. But thank you so much to all of our panelists who have delivered, even though they may not think they have, incredibly coherent. It's always coherent to the chair, right? Incredibly coherent and hugely fascinating commentary. So yes, as Jamie Johnson says, big appreciative applause, virtual applause. So we've had a range of questions come in already, which I will kind of go through one by one until we get some new ones. Early question from Theo, and there are a series of questions actually about polling, but let's just stick with Theo's because it seems to sort of encapsulate everybody's. Why does the US always get the polling so wrong? And I think Alex may have to.
Well, I don't know that they always get it wrong, actually. The US pollsters, I think, generally actually better than the British ones. So if they get it wrong, then this is a big miss. I mean, there'll be lots of inquiries into what happened. and particularly if they've missed for the same reasons that they missed in 2016. Because you'd expect them to compensate for what they got wrong in 2016, which was an underestimate of what they got wrong in 2016 was misjudging who was going to vote. I mean, that's one of the problems with political polling is you're not just asking opinions and then we're trying to weight the different respondents. You've actually also got to try and work out who's actually going to vote out the people that you've spoken to. So there's an extra problem there. One of the things that they got wrong in 2016 was getting turnout wrong in terms of who was going to turn out. So if they've got that wrong again, that's the problem. And it may well be that, I think, as both Andrews said, Trump's vote's gone up a lot. So that may be, they just got the likely voter models wrong. But I think it's a little unfair to say why they're so bad. Polling everywhere is difficult. And one of the problems is just in the way we interpret polling. So if you say that somebody's going to win 51-49 and the other person wins 51-49, that's not a big polling error, but it's got the result wrong. So everybody focuses on it. If you say that somebody's going to win 55-45 and they win 65-35, that's a much bigger polling error. But nobody really talks about it because you've actually got the winner right. But having said that, they've missed by a lot here, and I think that's a problem. I guess maybe this is my subject discipline, but I think when polling is getting things this wrong, then it's a worry, and hopefully the pollsters will do their work hard to find out what they did get wrong. One thing just quickly to finish on that is I wouldn't take much notice of the exit polls at the moment, just in terms of trend. I'm like political scientist. I'm fascinated by who votes for who, but the early exit polls I would leave and wait, particularly this year because so many people did mail-in voting, so many people voted early. What is clear is that the people who voted on the day really went big for Trump. So sort of doing exit polling of people who voted, we really need to do a lot of work to get good exit polls and a good understanding of the American public. And judging public opinion is really important. If we're misjudging public opinion because we're doing bad polling, that really matters in terms of good public policy, or when we need to talk to people and persuade them of what's good or what's important. So it's a good question. I mean, it's a little bit unfair in terms of the way it was worded, but I think it's a good question in terms of the way we think about the importance of polls.
Can I just add to that I think it also reflects the complexity and the heterogeneity of the United States as a country. We're looking at divisions within previously divided groups that pollsters hadn't really thought about in detail before. The fact that Cuban men were so different from Latino women, for example, in Florida. And I think what it does do for me as a historian is it reflects one of the reasons why the United States is such a beguiling place to study. It is so complicated. There are so many different currents and eddies and undercurrents that it's very difficult to come to a very clear view of what's happening and what might happen in the future.
Great. Question here from Caitlin. What do you think about the two speeches made by Trump and Biden in which they both declared victory and did not declare victory, respectively? And I think then Caitlin plays devil's aubergine and suggests that maybe they did both essentially declare victory.
How many vegetables does the devil have, Zalfa?
3. Anyone want to comment on the two speeches?
Speak for themselves, I think. I think I put in the chat that Fox have actually been quite responsible so far in the way they've reported this. When Trump made his speech, I think it was at 2:00 in the morning US time, maybe late. I maybe get my times mixed up. Brett Baer, who was sort of on air, sort of said, "Well, all that he said's just true." And Chris Wallace, who is the voice of reason on Fox, Chris Wallace just shot him down and said, "We've got a flammable situation, and Trump's just thrown a match on it." So if Fox aren't becoming too much of an echo chamber, then that's not a great. That's a good sign. I've not been watching Fox too much, so these reports are secondhand. But and I'm sure that in Breitbart and other sites and One American News are churning this up. I mean, it's bonkers. I mean, Trump's efforts to declare victory are bonkers. The idea that he says, I'll appeal this to the Supreme Court. The president for 4 years, you'd think he knows that's not how it works. But I'll stop because I'll just start shouting.
I'd want to. I mean, it feels like Trump's announcement was about 8 weeks ago now. I'd want to go back and see the exact wording, but from my memory, when I saw Biden's speech, it was clear that just subtle differences in phrasing again highlight the difference between what used to be expected of someone who was trying to be president and what is now apparently acceptable. I wasn't surprised that Trump just came out and said it, even though there was really no evidence at that stage. And then Biden, even when things were looking more like it, we're going to swing his way, was still cautious. And like I said, no surprise there whatsoever.
I think just to add very briefly to that, two things. One, I think that comes back to the narrative that Trump knows that he has to try and build. The other one I think is interesting because for the first time, really, and crikey, didn't take them a while, Trump's tweets have been fact-checked and flagged as being problematic, and that was clearly a tactic, knowing that this was all coming. I think that the Biden camp probably had done the same thing, and in a way that the Biden speech was designed and engineered as a kind of fact checker of knowing what the Trump camp was going to do and how that was going to play out. So again, I don't think that was a spur of the moment thing. I imagine that they had been thinking for some time, given all of the discussions before the election about what Trump was likely to do, and he did exactly what many commentators, not pollsters, but many commentators thought that he would do.
Our next question has been asked again in a couple of different ways. This articulation from Theo: do you believe that voter fraud is taking place? I'm going to rephrase that. Is voter fraud taking place? This isn't really a place for what we believe. And as a follow-up, is there a legal precedent, asks Hannah, for Trump to stop the counting of votes, especially when he only wants to stop counting in the states where he's ahead? Good question, Hannah.
There's no evidence for voter fraud at the moment.
I would just add to that there is far greater evidence of voter fraud back in the historical annals of the United States than there is in this election.
There's quite a lot of evidence of voter suppression.
What they said.
Yeah, there's no, in terms of stopping the vote, no. There are different states have different laws about who's allowed to witness the vote being counted. So Pennsylvania does allow people from the different campaigns to witness, to go in, and they have a right to go in and watch votes being counted. But there's no, unless the courts get involved. I mean, they can go to the Pennsylvania courts to challenge, as happened in 2000 in terms of the Gore campaign got the Florida Supreme Court to rule that counting should continue, and then the Supreme Court ruled that would be undone. So there are routes through the Trump campaign has launched multiple legal challenges today that may end up in the Supreme Court, but you don't just jump to the Supreme Court. But no, there's no grounds for that.
I get a sense that there's a sense in Trump's building narrative. If you take the view that he's like a toddler who hasn't quite got bored with his toys yet. Well, hang on, I just anointed someone to the Supreme Court, so I can go there and they'll do my bidding for me. Because as Alex said, that's just not how it works, unless you think you have this authoritarian streak who can just bend things to your will. So I guess one of the things that will be really interesting over the coming days and probably weeks, maybe more than that, is testing the strength of America's democratic institutions.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, Someone else coming in?
I was just going to say, I mean, when Amy Coney Barrett was being confirmed, I mean, Trump explicitly said that he wanted 9 members in the court for if the election was decided in the court. So, you know, the one good thing about Trump is amongst this spew of nonsense, he can't help but, you know, out himself in terms of what he's after.
But in the past, and I guess this is the break from historical continuities, that would be giving him enough rope to hang himself. But what it's doing now is increasing his vote.
Yeah.
I wonder if we can't spend a moment not talking about Donald Trump or Kat. I just did a series of double negatives, apologies. Let's not talk about Donald Trump for a moment. Jamie asks about Biden. Assuming a Biden victory, is it likely that policy achievements will largely be confined to foreign policy, like rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, recommitting to the Iran nuclear deal? Will Biden, given the Senate, have the means to pursue a robust domestic agenda? Great question. Thank you, Jamie. This is, of course, followed up by Redden's question about what Biden's policies are.
Well, I mean, I'm just going to jump right in there to say I'm not going to comment on the domestic situation. I'll let people who know better than me respond to that. But rejoining the Paris Agreement in terms of climate change would be a major win for the entire world. And certainly in terms of climate action, Biden does have a lot of policies, and they spell positive interventions in the destruction of the Amazon, as I talked about a few weeks ago. They spell investment in the creation of green jobs, investment in green industries, and various other things as well. But so I think at least on the environmental front, it will make a big difference, both for the United States, but at a global level as well.
I guess, and I don't think it's a cop-out, but this is what happens when someone like me looks forwards rather than backwards, and you'll realise why I so often look backwards. Pennsylvania hasn't been called yet. We don't even know if he's going to be president.
True. I just in terms of, but if just going to the point earlier about the Senate, there'll be no, if Mitch McConnell's Senate Majority Leader, I mean, the best scenario at the moment is that there's a 50-48 and we get 2 runoffs, which I'll explain to my students in a couple of weeks. We get 2 runoffs in Georgia in January, which looks like it may be the case at the moment. The idea that the Democrats are going to win 2 runoffs in Georgia in January seems highly unlikely to me. But if that does happen, then you've got a 50-50 Senate, which would give control to, and if you had a Biden presidency, that would give control to the Democrats. But, you know, you've got to, even in that best case scenario, you've got Joe Manchin in West Virginia, you've got Kirsten Sinema in Arizona, you've got, you know, even Michael Bennet in Colorado is not going to pass a really radical agenda. So, no. I have no idea how that will function. It just seems a recipe for something not good. The Iran question is a good one. I don't know the answer. The Iran deal, I don't know what they do. That's a really good question, and I don't know what the answer is.
I mean, I don't have a huge amount to add. Define robust. It's going to be tough, but at the same time, I mean, Biden faces some very large challenges. The immediate challenge of COVID, again, this is obviously, as George said, assuming he gets in, climate change, the ongoing sense for many Americans that the economy isn't necessarily working for them, and the gig economy in particular, I think the divide between those who feel they have and those who feel they have not. It's gonna be tough. It's gonna be tough for him to get a lot done. But at the same time, there aren't many periods in American history where all of the stars lined up in terms of the presidency. both houses and the judiciary that's supportive. I mean, I suppose the other half of the question, it assumes that a Biden foreign policy will necessarily be successful, and I think there's still some doubt as to exactly what a Biden foreign policy is going to look like, and to what extent he will basically continue the sort of Obama, Hillary Clinton approach, or whether he will show a little bit more restraint. And again, it's really hard to tell because the substantive issues just didn't come through in a mudslinging election that was largely about personality and what you were sort of lining up against, rather than what you were lining up for. And even when ideas were put forward, it struck me it didn't really make the news. So to a certain extent, I'm not one for blaming the media, but it just didn't make the headlines in the way that it should have.
Okay. Question from Charlotte. What response do you think Trump supporters will have if Biden does win? We've heard reports of increased gun sales and so on, and wonder to what extent you think they will go in. To what extent you think they will go in expressing their upset? I think, judging by the frankly quite terrifying videos of voters in, was it Arizona? It is slamming on the walls of where the votes are being counted, is one indication that it may not be as peaceful as we'd like. Does anyone else have anything to add? Was it Detroit? Thank you, Caitlin.
Well, people's worst fears certainly haven't come true, which I think is good. And I hope it stays that way. I hope that the sort of norms and conventions hold. Again, I suppose there's a sense that anything can happen, but I certainly hope that there is no violence, and that any is truly exceptional. I hope there is none.
I think, again, to bring a historian's perspective into this, that there are those long traditions of what used to be called ghetto riots, which is now known as the urban revolt, in response to federal policies that are aimed at further suppression or oppression. It'll be interesting to see how Biden manages to do that. To my mind, or to my knowledge, there's only one person in the past who has single-handedly been able to stop an urban revolt, and that was R&B legend James Brown in Boston when Bobby Kennedy was killed. I don't know whether Biden will become our new James Brown figure, but if he does, get on up, Joe.
Right. There are a couple of questions here about mail-in ballots. So, any thoughts, asks Caitlin, about USPS and supposed lost undelivered ballots, particularly in Florida and Miami-Dade? And Alex follows up with that. In the future, do you think because of its convenience, there could be a higher proportion of mail-in votes, or will it fall after the controversy of this year?
I'll try and answer them. The USPS thing, I haven't seen much follow-up on that. That may be one of the sort of more liberal conspiracy type theories. I'm not quite sure. Clearly, there was something happening. I think some of the early reports were a little bit exaggerated in terms of the volume of votes that hadn't been delivered. We'll have to chase. That just needs. The evidence isn't clear enough yet whether there's a there, or whether it was genuinely. I mean, clearly. I mean, when Trump appoints a lackey to be the head of the USPS, it sort of naturally raises concerns. But quite whether there's a real story there. I'm not sure. Alex's question is an interesting one. Some states basically already on the West Coast, not California, but the Northwest, Oregon and Washington have already effectively entirely vote by mail. My guess is that the momentum will be to more vote by mail as people get more used to it and it's made more secure. The problems this time around, because so many states switched very late on because of COVID to more vote by mail. So it's it's true. It depends who wins, and how states see things, and individual states will react differently.
I think as well, part of the controversy, as I understand it, this year in some states, has not been the number of mail-in votes. It's been when they've been allowed to start counting them. There's no reason why, to my mind, apart from arcane local state-level laws, why states couldn't have counted a number of those mail-in votes in advance, and then we wouldn't have this drag on.
Well, the cynical answer to that, George, would be that so if you don't like the way the vote is looking, you can stop those votes being counted.
But we're historians, Andrew, not cynics.
It's perfectly possible to be both. In fact, I think there's quite a lot of overlap on that particular Venn diagram.
Is there a map of those as well?
It's in the other room. Thanks.
Missing several pieces. Right, we've got a range of questions around that we kind of have discussed, but since there isn't a huge amount coming in at the moment in the chat, so do keep everything coming in. Otherwise, you will force us to go and have our dinner and have an evening to ourselves, and we definitely wouldn't want that. So this question from Macaulay is around demographics and voting. He suggests there's a new Gallup poll that puts 81% of African Americans wanting more police and order, presumably law and order. I began my seminar yesterday at 10 a.m. with a poll that suggested white women had once again voted for a white supremacist alleged sexual predator. So I don't know who this is for in terms of my question, but certainly the question is about these particular demographics. Are they acting in an especially surprising way for a reason, do we think? Or does it just happen that that they seem to be voting in contradictory ways? You're on mute, Alex, sorry.
Well, I was just gonna ask Alex if it's figures like that he was referring to earlier around exit polls and the caution of starting to interpret those too soon, in the nature of exit polls this year are very different from how they normally would be, if I understood that correctly. I don't know, perhaps Alex can explain more.
Yeah, that's absolutely what I meant, Deborah. I mean, clearly a lot of white women did vote for Trump, but whether it's the majority or not is we'll see. I mean, whether it's, in a sense, it goes back again to, does it matter whether it's 49 or 51% of white women vote for Trump? It sort of matters in terms of the overall who wins and who loses, but in terms of attitudes and what it says about, I think what you do want to do is break down by education as well. I mean, that actually is becoming a more important indicator than it certainly. I mean, income and education are clearly correlated, folks. So that's why you should all get your degree. But more seriously, education has become a better indicator than income in terms of certainly predicting white voting behaviour. But absolutely, the polls on this, I think, will be a little bit wary. What is clear and is counterintuitive is the increase in support for Trump amongst Latino voters. Now, there's a couple of things to get to there. One is, and they're related, is one whether it makes sense to talk of Latino voters now as a group. I think I can see Deborah nodding her head, so she might want to come in and say something about that. But what I think, and George hinted at this earlier in terms of the sort of one of the Trump campaign's successful appeals particularly to voters of Cuba and in Venezuela, really mattered in Florida. the Trump campaign did a great ground game in Florida. They worked really hard with the Cuban community, and that's, looking at results in Miami-Dade County, the Biden team are expecting to win by 20-25%. Democrats broadly are expecting to win by 25% in Miami-Dade. They've won by about 8% in Miami-Dade. A couple of Democrat House seats have gone in South Florida. So I'm not sure what that tells us, but it does sort of illustrate that we need to be really careful. And certainly in terms of how we think about these numbers, it looks like Trump's increased his support amongst African Americans by 3 or 4% from 2016. Again, which seems counterintuitive to me. Big gender split there, and an age split as well. Younger African American men more likely to vote for Trump. Again, if I said anything, I'd probably be making, well, I won't. So, but we really need to check those data points that they're accurate. But certainly the thing about South Florida, it has to be true, just the way the results went.
Can I just add to that I think one of the almost anecdotal, kind of well-hewn anecdotes about African American voting in the past is, they supported civil rights reform, therefore they were voting for the presidents who delivered that, and LBJ, JFK before him, benefited greatly from that. And one of the kind of hoary old chestnuts is 98% of African Americans voted for LBJ. Well, what happened to the other 2%? I think one of the things that's too easy to forget is not all African Americans supported the civil rights movement. It was really small in comparative terms. There were probably, most people think, only about 3,000 people who actually marched as part of the civil rights movement. There was a whole African American middle class that didn't take part and were not necessarily supportive. And I think it is, I agree with Alex, it's counterintuitive to think that African Americans would vote for Trump. But at the same time, I think it is oversimplistic to think that all African Americans will immediately vote Democrat. And in the same way that if you look at Florida this time, as Alex has just explained, there are so many different issues at play. COVID doesn't appear to have been the big issue that everybody thought it was going to be. A number of exit polls, which I know can be dubious, are suggesting that whether or not you had a job to lose was more important than whether COVID was going to make you lose it. And in that way, people voted more Trump than they would anti-Trump. The really interesting thing in Florida about South American and Caribbean and Central American migrant populations is the extent to which red baiting works. Because what do? You say, well, Biden's a socialist. That's a single line. That's your tag. It's one poster. It's one bumper sticker. To try and explain why Biden's not a socialist, people have turned off by the time you've got halfway through the podcast. It's just such a simple message to get across to a willing constituency, and that the intersectionality of those of the ideas that lead people to vote, I think, is very complex. And that comes back to my view of the polling as well, that I think in some areas that they've underestimated the complexity of those intersectional concerns.
Can I just, this isn't contradict to what George said at all, just can I actually dive back into Macaulay's, one of the opening premise of his question was about African-American voters supporting, not supporting, in terms of attitudes towards policing. Yeah, the polling tells us, and that's right, in terms of, the defund the police is a white middle-class liberal catchphrase. It doesn't come from the African-American community. It was the African-American, older African-American voters which got Biden a nomination. I think one of the misinterpretations is to see, because African-American voters are so strongly Democratic, with a big D, that they're particularly liberal. That's not the case. Again, oversimplifying hugely and talking about the African American vote, which we wouldn't do in terms of the white vote. But we need to be careful how we think about these things. It's clear that African American voters want to be stopped being brutalized by the police, but they also want where they live to be properly policed, and those two things should not be in contradiction.
Absolutely. What's great about the chat in this week is that people are actually having great conversations, sort of independent to everybody's responses. Here's an example. Caitlin asks, do you think the huge turnout this year will continue, or was this election an anomaly because it was considered so divisive and important? Jamie, kind of building on that, I wonder how we should interpret such high voter turnout figures in relation to debates about the slow death of democracy. Are high turnout figures a sign of a healthy or unhealthy democracy? Which is a great question, both of them.
Yeah, if you were Australian, you would think this turnout was appalling.
All I would say is that I think high turnout is probably, in fact, it can only be a good thing. And in terms of what it means for a democracy, I think that's a good thing. But there are so many other parts of the American democratic system, some of which are less democratic, and it's how all of those things work together. And I think this is a good thing. But again, there's a lot around it, and the way that again elections are framed, the way that again issues seem to have fallen by the wayside. And there are many other aspects of the American sort of wider political system that are more worrying than this. I think, you can't argue with a good turnout, although Trump is, it seems, currently trying to do so.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, in a sense, it just needs it's too much for a thought piece question to be answered quickly. But obviously, Andrew's right that I think people voting is a good thing. I agree with me. But there are institutional features now about American democracy that are really becoming obviously problematic. The Electoral College, very obviously, to me, the makeup of Senate is actually even more problematic now. That Wyoming's got as many senators as California has no. But that's not going to change. The Electoral College, there's a half a chance that might change. The Senate's not going to change. But also, if you just look at the Supreme Court, the fact that you've got, I've forgotten the numbers now, but so many recent Supreme Court justices have come from being nominated by Republican presidents. When Republicans are nominated by Republican presidents who didn't win the popular vote, it becomes problematic.
I was just going to add, I think maybe some better signs of deciding healthy and unhealthiness of democracies are probably going to come in the weeks and months to come. So completely agree about the goodness of people voting and voting in large numbers, but I think it's also really important sort of levels of political participation and activism, and not just in terms of actually in everything but party politics. I think is really the sign of a healthy democracy, and will, as these various issues play out over the next few weeks and months, depending on who wins and who doesn't, I think we'll start to see whether or not that big turnout translates into political participation and activism in other ways. In terms of, that might be protests, it might be forms of civil unrest, it might be grassroots organizations, it might be a range of other things, but we're steering dangerously close to I'm steering dangerously close to the area of predictions here, which I'm not going to do. So, but basically, I think we'll see in the coming months whether or not this is a healthy or unhealthy democracy.
Just quickly,
that sounded a lot like a prediction, I will say.
Just one thing in terms of making Senate more democratic, one thing which will not happen now because of the Democrats not going to have enough numbers is the 51 for 51 movement, which was get 51 votes in Senate to push towards DC statehood and even possibly Puerto Rico statehood. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, that was a question I think that came up a couple of weeks ago. Right, we have it's 7:18 by my computer. So if you have any questions, put them in now. We will answer questions submitted by, it's 7:19. We will answer questions put in the chat box by 7:20, and then we're going to dinner separately. So please do type them in. I've got one here from Bledden. who very helpfully spelled out the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. Otherwise, I was going to go from total potato. He says, if he wins, what do you expect from Biden regarding the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
All right, Andrew. Particularly strong on this.
Shall we say low expectations? High expectations? Let's just go for generic distance.
Average expectations. Jeff.
Yeah, I don't think expectations will exceed the average.
The TPP is it's hard. You'd have to do a hell of a lot of renegotiation. So I don't know what happens. Oh dear. I'm nothing to say.
That's fine. I think we've had literally one question come in before my time limit, and then, well, two, I suppose. So we will answer these two questions, and then we will go home or into another room. Will faithless electors, asks Craig, affect the outcome when they vote?
I doubt it. The Supreme Court ruled earlier this year that states can enforce electors to vote for the who their state has voted for. So I doubt it. Sorry, I'm being hesitant. I actually knew a faithless elector, bizarrely, but he died last year. So, but I don't think it's going to be a big issue, to be honest.
Where do faithless electors go when they die?
And folks, we have reached that time of the evening, so we'll just deal with Julia's question from earlier, which I missed. So apologies, Julia. Why do you think, and this kind of brings us back to the start of the session, why do you think Arizona is one of the states that's leaning more towards and looking like being won by the Democrats? Why is Arizona, compared to places like Florida, when it's historically been Republican, not really a swing state?
Anybody? I mean, I'll take that first. Take some. It's a good question, Julia. One thing I did expect people. It's been fantastic questions, actually. Really good, really great. I was expecting to be bombarded with questions about what if Bernie had been the nominee, and if Bernie had been the nominee, Trump would have won Arizona in a landslide. I think this is where Biden being the candidate really helps. I mentioned earlier Mark Kelly's a Democratic candidate for Senate. Looks like he will win, and he's really moderate. And this isn't. I would rather we had a left-ear president than Joe Biden. So don't misinterpret what I'm saying. But Arizona will. It looks like it could become more of a swing state. I mean, I've mentioned Kirsten Sinema a couple of times, who won statewide in 2018, first Democrat to win get a Senate seat in Arizona for ages, and she's incredible. She's really frustrating in some ways for other Democrats in Senate because she is so moderate and will break the party line. But in a way, they have to do that. And if the Democrat Party can put up a coalition that keeps together Kirsten Sinema and Bernie Sanders. Then they can win, but they have to accommodate themselves to the restrictions that places them under in terms of pursuing the sort of progressive agenda that lots of people would like to see. Also, there is this goes back to the issue around the Latino population. The Latino population of Arizona is very different from the Latino population of Florida.
All I would add to that is Cuba. It makes there's a massive difference. Just is one massive difference between two states that are a significant geographical distance away, as Andrew's map would show us.
Cuba's not on it. Cuba's here.
And that, friends and listeners, is why Florida's a red state.
Yes, just quickly, actually, on the Latino vote, lots of people thought Texas might be really competitive this year, and it was, this is one of why Biden's doing so well in the popular vote, because Republicans pre-Trump would win Texas by 10 points, 12 points, so Biden getting to win 4 or 5 points is interesting, but actually, again, it looks like, and again, we need lots more data to back this up, but it looks like Biden really underperformed with Latino voters across the Rio Grande. It's so that it does tell us that this is we need to really try and just to get a better understanding. There's really complex stories that need to be understood and then told.
Okay, I think that's it, folks. I think we're all spent. Thank you to everyone who's faithfully turned up each week for the last 5 weeks. And if you only joined us today, that's fine too. Thank you for joining us. Thanks most of all to our colleagues and our panelists today, but our colleagues in general who have been absolutely brilliant and really good-natured in answering questions and dealing with bumbling moderators. But yeah, if you enjoyed this event, send us ideas for more events that you'd like to see. This is absolutely something that we want to keep doing. Especially as we're all online, there are different ways that we can be talking to each other and seeing each other and engaging with the things about which we are really passionate and about topical stuff. So thank you all and bye.
Thank you to Zelfa and Alex for organising it all and for moderating us. Thank you both.
It wouldn't have happened if Zelfa hadn't.
Alex.
Yes, especially thank you to Zelfa.
Dear, oh dear, I'll stop recording now.